Welcome everybody to the 12th seminar in the Contemporary Women's Writing and Medical Humanities seminar series. This seminar series is organised with the support of the Centre for Contemporary Women's Writing at the IMLR, so the Institute of Modern Languages Research in London. So the series is for postgraduates and early career researchers, and it seeks to explore how contemporary women's writing in particular, whether it's fiction, poetry, autobiographical or philosophical writing, is currently engaging with issues such as illness, disease, healthcare, medical practice and clinical institutions. There are a wide range of themes being covered or that have been covered. This is our penultimate seminar. And we also have a continuation of the seminar series in the form of our conference at the end of July this year. And Ben and I are just in the process of finalising the programme. So you should all be spammed lovingly with emails and tweets about it within the next week or so. Now for some Zoom house rules. So this session is being recorded, so it can be uploaded to the IMLR website. Please feel free to keep your, to turn your cameras off or on, whichever you feel most comfortable with. We'll be having 3 papers today and then a Q&A session. If you could all remain on mute too until the Q&A session, that would be much appreciated. During the Q&A, if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the raise hand option on Zoom. And then either Ben or I will ask you to unmute and you can voice your question yourself. You can also put your questions at the end of the papers or, running throughout the papers as, inspiration comes. You can add them into the chat and then we'll come to them later in the Q&A. And again, you can either voice them yourselves, camera on, camera off, or you can nominate Ben or I to read out the question for you. I think that's it. Oh no, wait, another point. We've got, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, I hope we've got live captions going on. So if you can't see them, if you go onto the bottom bar of your Zoom window where you have, icons like participants, chat, share screen, etc. There's a thing, there's a CC sign that says live transcript. And then if you click on live captioning, then that will come up, but it should be working so everyone sees it at the moment. Something else that we'll be doing, which we have been doing for the past couple of seminars, is auto description. So I will give a brief kind of description of myself, and then Ben will do so too when he introduces the speakers, and the speakers also will do that. Okay, so I'm a 29-year-old white British woman, long kind of blondish hair and a plait with gold glasses and a stripy top. It's very French studies. So anyway, all right, I'll pass over to Ben, who'll be doing the rest of the introduction.
Thanks very much, Becky. So tonight's seminar is entitled Women, Mental Health and Identity. And before I introduce the speakers, I'll just self-describe as well. So I'm a 30-year-old white man with a big beard and wearing today a kind of like acrylic black jumper with like little geometric patterns on it. And yes, so without further ado, we've got 3 speakers tonight, and we're going to start with Anne Matijo. So Anne Matijo is a PhD candidate, ABD, at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Her dissertation looks at how women Caribbean writers appropriate madness to reconstruct the various discourses elaborated about their identities. Her work aims at challenging the notion of empirical scientific observation as the primary source of valid knowledge. It inscribes itself within the larger context of health humanities and through the lens of decolonialism. And tonight, Anne's paper is called Madness and Identity in 2 Novels from Martinician women writers Fabienne Canor and Nicole Cage-Ferrantini. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Benjamin and Rebecca, for organizing this great seminar series. So I'm going to auto-describe. I'm a woman in my mid-30s, and I'm wearing a black cardigan. So let me share my screen. And can you guys see that? Okay. Okay, great. Okay, starting the timer too. So the beauty of these seminars is that I got to hear from people from a variety of fields. And it's also what's considered a challenge a little bit, because I'm trying to find the balance necessary by providing contextual information that's needed and not repeating stuff that most of you may be already familiar with. So forgive me, some of the preliminary information is familiar to some of you. And I also had to make some slight adjustment to my presentation, because the title was a bit misleading. I want to make sure I can reach the entire audience. So the arguments remain the same, but I decided to only talk about one of the two authors instead of the two, to illustrate how literature can be put in dialogue with medical science. So this work and my work in general, it's still in the beginning phases, but I focus on the islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe. The population of Martinique and Guadeloupe mostly consists of descendants of African slaves. And they're regions of France, and they technically they have the same rights and privileges as France. So, however, as many scholars and researchers and writers have noted, in practice, it's not really the case. The unemployment rate is soaring. The cost of life is much more expensive. And then there's a lot of inequalities tied to race and social class. Most of the land is still owned by the white descendants of the plantation and slave owners, which we call the Beke. And it's they who have a monopoly over the major industries that make these islands run. So you'll ask me what all this has to do with contemporary women writing and medical humanities. So here I am getting to it. So the logic behind slavery, as you may know, was essentially a scientific one. It was paired with the birth of capitalism and modernity. So according to Shoshana Feldman, scientific racism justified the slave trade by claiming the psychological inferiority of Black Africans. For another scholar, Sybil Fisher, the scientific decoupage of race was legitimized to justify the need for a workforce to work on the Caribbean sugar plantations. So, and all of this was happening roughly at the same time of the Enlightenment ideas, which led to one of the most important founding principle of the French Republic, the 1789 Declaration of the Right of Men. And in Enlightenment ideas, let's recall, we're moving away from a knowledge based on God in favor of a knowledge centered on science and on man, right? Capital M and man in quotes. So this period has been ironically called the Age of Reason, and it's considered by most to be the starting point of modernity, to quote Feldman again. So you'll notice on the slide how slavery in Martinique and Guadeloupe went on for another 60 years. And that's what post-colonial historians and writers argue, is that the effects of colonialism are still very real, and it's all over the French news right now. So for Fisher, quote, slavery in the Caribbean was one of the first and most brutal appearances of modernity, unquote. Modernity as a concept then is problematically intertwined with an instrumentalization of human life. And as an institution, Fisher stresses the need to understand, quote, to what extent modernity is a product of the New World, and to what extent the colonial experience shaped modernity. Let's see. So in the book I want to discuss today, I'm interested in looking at how Fabienne Canor is using madness to complicate the notion of empirical form of knowledge, to reappropriate discourses on identity, on knowledge that's often othered, but to instead focus on women of color's perspectives and embodied experience. In D'eau douce, Canor relates the everyday experiences of her main character, Frida. And then the narrative strategies that Canor, I think, are a great way to gain insight on the broader social system in which they're situated, because they're articulated through the viewpoint of someone who's excluded from, quote unquote, ruling relations of power, right? On many levels, Frida is a minoritized woman who is, as she herself states, folle crazy. So Frida is a young Black woman. She's a university student. and her parents left Guadeloupe to settle in a Parisian suburb where she lives. Frida goes mad after her white lover leaves her, at which point she murders him. And the entire story takes place in the bedroom where Frida is laying on the corpse. The story is told in a first person, and it's Frida who speaks. And Frida claims she's going to give us the details of the murder before, quote, blowing her brains out, unquote. But instead of strictly talking about the murder, Frida tells her entire life story. So we get that individual personal account of her own story, but there's a constant movement of detachment on the part of Frida, a detachment from herself. Often she'll talk about herself in the third person, saying things like, now I'm juggling screens, it's interesting. Saying things like, je la vois, elle pleure, I see her, she's crying, right? And this back and forth between the first person and the third person acts as a strategy for distanciation of the self, right? And in my opinion, that has two consequences. The first one is that it allows Canor to displace the personal narrative and to put it into a more general context. And when one reads the text, it's easy to understand that when Canor writes about Frida, she could also be, in fact, writing about the experience of the Antillean woman in general. And then the second consequence, I think, would be by choosing to make the voice relating those events, those of a mad woman, Canor opens the possibility to consider a form of knowledge that is independent from that established since the age of reason I mentioned above. So let me get closer to the text here to give you a better idea of what I mean. Let's see. So a lot of the story details, let me go back actually. A lot of the story details the relationship Frida has with her mother and with other university students and friends. So Frida's mother keeps pushing stereotypes that have been passed on to her by her mother before her, etc., etc. So bodily and sexual norms that have been pushed into Black people's mentalities ever since the age of reason. So some of the stereotypes that Frida's mother pushed onto Frida include the way Frida's hair should be, defrizzed and straightened, more like white people's hair, her future choice of husband, preferably white, certainly not African. So this next quote is on the slide in both French and English. Frida voit sa mère pliée en quatre sur le carrelage qui astique tout ce qu'elle trouve sur son passage. Pas sa faute, c'est sa propre mère qui le lui a appris. Lui a transmis les règles d'hygiène pour être une bonne épouse, une bonne mère, une bonne à tout faire. Grand-mère collée à sa terre rouge, mémé aux pieds plats, au français qui, va-et-vient, détruisant au passage une huitaine de syllabes et de voyelles. Grand-mère dans l'ombre d'un mari toujours parti, 1000 fois père, qui babille sa femme toute la sainte année. Dieu, jusqu'où descendra-t-elle? Maman n'a jamais su qu'elle avait le choix, qu'elle pouvait aller plus loin que là où le bateau s'arrête. In the first quote, we go from relating the specific experience of Frida's mother, who's trapped in gender roles, to a multi-generational dimension, the grandmother, the mother before her, etc. And that last sentence, an interrogation, is in my sense purposefully unclear, right? Who does the pronoun elle, who does the pronoun she refer to? Does it refer to Frida's mother, to Frida's grandmother? Does it refer to Guadeloupean women in general? To Black women in general, right? And then the second, much shorter quote repeats the idea that the behavior that Frida's mother has is because she doesn't know she can do differently than her ancestors, all the way back to when le bateau s'arrête, right? So that gives you an idea of how Canor works against assumptions that are built since colonial times. So Frida is, and Black women are put under a lot of pressure from their family to adhere to certain stereotypes. But Frida is also put under a lot of pressure by her own peers at the university setting, and a set of she's pressured to adhere to a set of norms that may be even contradictory to that of her family. So Frida lives in university housing with other students of color who are all about, they're all about Black liberation and Black equality. And I believe that Canor heightens those post-colonial set of norms in order to mock and parody them. So while in university housing, Frida is expected to not have sex with any white man. So of course, this rule only applies to women, as you may see from that second set of slides. So what Canor has Frida do is attempt to resist all and every one of these assumptions. And what Canor parodies is this ensemble of norms that are put on the Black female body. It doesn't matter what they are. I think Canor's point is that there should not be any assumptions and expectation that the Black female body has constantly been directed in one direction or another during colonial times, shortly after colonial times, in a decidedly post-colonial time. So Canor wants to decolonize the Black body, and she also does the same thing for the Black Antillean man, which I'm not going to go into it now, but here I wanted to expose the tensions that Frida experiences in her daily life to get to my second point, which explicits how madness plays a role into this. So now the questions are, how does Canor break the assumptions that I just talked about? These assumptions that pull Frida in all kind of directions, right? I argue that Canor situates the Antillean identity independently of normative discourses on cultural identity, so free from the discourses that abide the Cartesian logic or the values of the bourgeois world, like Maryse Condé would say. Whereas Cartesian logic aspires to detach consciousness from the natural world and to inaugurate consciousness as the knowledge, as the science, the one that commands forces of nature and the body, I would say that Canor chooses to locate her telling of the events outside of the hegemony of an imposed rationality, outside of an exacted form of reason. I'd like to suggest that what Canor is doing is to allow us to revisit the question of the quest for identity according to its own criteria. And this is what Patricien Donatien theorizes as being the bless aesthetic. And the bless is a quote-unquote Creole syndrome. Western medical terminology would call it a somatic symptom disorder. The Encyclopedic Dictionary of the Antilles and Guyana states that, and that's on your screen, la blesse est un syndrome créole qu'il est difficile de traduire en termes médicaux occidentaux. La maladie est décrite comme un désordre des organes qui peut être mortel. So the Martinican Creole and French dictionary defines it as, I'm trying to, there you go. As a disease, right, I'm quoting this slide now. Cette maladie se caractérise par des douleurs au niveau du thorax, du dos. En outre, la personne est faible, elle a de la fièvre, elle vomit, elle maigrit. Certains parlent même d'un corps étranger à l'intérieur de la poitrine. Cette maladie est causée par un traumatisme. Cette maladie ne peut être vue et soignée que par certaines personnes spécialisées. Les médecins ne savent pas la diagnostiquer, end quote. And then Donatien also states that the pain can be in the heart or even in the head, which means that it is more serious. So for Donatien, this disease is tied to an aesthetic, and it's tied to an aesthetic that is characteristic of all post-colonial writings. And for Donatien, the body of the Caribbean artist talks. I'm quoting this slide now. Le corps parle de ses souffrances, le corps parle de son âme, le corps parle de sa mémoire, le corps parle de sa blesse. C'est donc à partir de l'observation et de la mise en parallèle de productions plastiques et littéraires, mais également par une réflexion sur la base constituante de notre être, c'est-à-dire sur notre manière de nous concevoir, sur notre perception des aspects essentiels de notre existence, la vie, la mort, le rapport à l'univers, à la mythologie, à la spiritualité, que j'ai émis l'hypothèse d'une esthétique de la blesse. Unquote. So according to Donatien, this process of verbalisation du mal, right, of putting word on one's wounds, is what allows for healing. By initiating the retelling of the characters' individual stories, the writer exposes the névrose communautaire, right, the common neurosis, as Donatien says. So first the author identifies the bless, and then they can start the healing process. Donatien calls it a form of literary diagnostic, which manifests itself differently according to the characters, the author, and the text. It can take the form of, quote, madness, suicide, alcoholism, the individual's physical or mental degeneration, wandering, rotting of the body, unquote. And for Donatien, it's not limited to literature. Other form of art can express the bless. So some may say it's a form of art therapy, which can be inscribed in theories of care. And that's a topic that's already been quite explored, but the important difference when considering the bless is that it's endogenous to the Caribbean. It's not a concept that is brought from the outside or that has been appropriated by the outside, like some may argue is the case with post-colonialism. And also, the blessed aesthetic is careful to use at its core cultural and mythological elements, which are proper to the Caribbean context. So in Canor's text, madness then is not displaced outside of a reference where mental health is something that's prescribed by the West, right? But rather, it's something that inscribes itself deeper inside of the reality of the Caribbean cultures. And this contrasts with some of the major references medical providers use, at least in the US, to diagnose mental disorders. I don't have time to address in details here. But my point ultimately is that it's as if the conditions of Frida's entire life are the precursor or pre-existing condition, if you may, of this eruption of violence. It's only what the West calls, it's only in what the West called madness that Frida can make sense of her life. It's only there that she can, sorry, I lost my place, that she can acquire enough distance to be able to articulate not only her life, but that of the entire Guadeloupean people. And then one last interesting detail before I jump onto my conclusion is that Frida's name is very close to that of Erzulie Freda or Mama Wata. Erzulie Freda and Mama Wata are the spirit of love associated with water and femininity in the Hoodoo and Cambois religion of Martinique and Guadeloupe. Hoodoo and Cambois are kind of like similar to the more popular voodoo that people are more familiar with in Haiti, but right away cannot associate her character with a type of knowledge that is not necessarily based on science or that's not empirically based. So as a way of conclusion, by distancing her main character from pre-established assumptions that govern the mind, Canor offers at the same time a comment on the possibility of a decolonization of the body. Fisher, once again, reminds us that at its core, modernity entailed a rationalization for the instrumentalization of human life, right? So rationalization is a process of the mind for the instrumentalization of human life acting on bodies. Through the blessed aesthetic, those same dichotomies, real, unreal, sane, mad, can be articulated in a more holistic manner, one in which both fields of literature and medicine can work together. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much for that. That was absolutely brilliant. I love these ideas of how madness can resist and undo and challenge empirical, scientific, and colonial discourses and knowledge structures. And I'm sure we've got so much more that we can talk about in the Q&A session. Thanks very much, Anne. Move on now to our second presentation, which is by Beredeh Wejdan. So Beredeh Wejdan is 29 years old and lives in Guelma, Algeria. She has been an English teacher in the secondary school in Guelma town for almost 6 years and is currently a third-year PhD student at Algiers 2 University, Abu al-Qasim Sadala in Algeria. She specializes in American literature. And Beredeh's title for today is Between Patriarchy and Madness, Forging Female Identity in Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior. So thanks very much, Beredeh.
Thank you so much for introducing me. Before getting started, I would like to say that I am very honored to be with you today to this online seminar. Actually, it is the first time I go through this experience and present my paper on an international scale through the Zoom application or the Zoom medium. As you have spoken before, I am Bradley Wujdan. I am 29 years old, and I am from Galma. It is a small town in Algeria, in eastern Algeria. Like some of you have introduced their physical appearance. So I have a brown eyes and the fair hair, though I am veiled now. I am a little bit fat. So this is the description, and I have a brown eyes. So this is a brief description of my physical appearance. As far as my paper is concerned, so shall I share my PowerPoint with you? Okay, can you see it now?
Not quite yet.
Can you hold on a minute, please? Is it okay now?
Yeah, that's brilliant. We can see that now.
Okay. So, as you have mentioned before, the title of my presentation is Patriarchy and Madness, Forging Female Visibility in Maxime Kingston's The Woman Warrior, Memories of Girlhood Among Ghosts. This is the presentation outline. So it is going to start with an introduction. Then I am going to move with the title of Between Madness and the Quest for Female Visibility. Madness, is it a reality or is it a metaphor in this novel? In this section, I am going to discuss three things. Marriage as an ideal institution to guarantee citizenship. And the second one is going to be madness as a mental illness generated by the phallocentric discourse. The third one is the significance of the asylum and the female in
Il est 19 heures.
And I am going to conclude it. Throughout history, we have always seen that madness is always associated with women, and literature is the best documentation for this phenomenon because it plays an important role in projecting such association through many narratives. For example, we have in early times in English literature, we have Shakespeare's Hamlet, we have also Charlotte Bronte in Jane Eyre, and Arthur Miller, The Crucible. So from the modern, from the early time to the modern time, we have these various representations of female insanity in literature, which always implied that women are weak, fragile, irrational, and dangerous creatures who need to be controlled. So they use the charge of madness as a way to silence and marginalize them. Therefore, all what they must do is to obey this and take it for granted. As a reaction to these distorted images, some contemporary female writers use madness as a strategy to challenge the real mad social and cultural norms of patriarchy that characterize men with reason, logic, and rationality, while accusing women and females with irrationality, impulsiveness, and recklessness. So Maxime Kingston's The Woman Warrior, Memories of Girlhood Among Ghosts, using, so it is the best example to illustrate this tool, I mean madness, to defy the patriarchal ideology or the patriarchal society in which this author lives in. So using the feminist approach, this paper is going to answer two main questions, which are madness, is it a metaphor or a reality? And again, is it a sign of strength or a sign of weakness in this story? So before trying to analyze issue of madness here, I would like to start with a brief summary of this novel. So The Woman Warrior is a novel written by Maxine Hong Kingston. She is a Chinese American. This novel was written in 1976. So it describes the Chinese suffering as an immigrant in the United States. Also, it is worthily mentioned that it is an autobiographical novel. So all the events, approximately all the events were about Maxine Hong from being a child until becoming an adult. So this novel also, it is a representative of those female Chinese immigrants who struggle to resist the two opposing codes, the Chinese and the American culture respectively. So we are, through this novel, we are going to touch what we call the clash of cultures, the Chinese culture and the American culture, both of which could not provide a safe home for Maxine. The story is divided into 5 sections. Each one has a name and a character. So in each section, there is a female protagonist in which our author Maxine is going to identify with her. So we have 5 sections, as I said: No Name Women, White Tigers, Shaman, At the Western Palace, and A Song of a Barbarian Reed Pipe. So it is worthily mentioned that Maxine Hong Kingston's autobiography is told through warrior women and through mad women. So these stories acquire a depth and meaning only when they intertwine or when they are collected with each other. So as I said before, these stories started with Maxine Hong Kingston being a child, then being an adult, and eventually a writer. So within these stories, there was a growing sense of selfhood. And also she, through these stories, she recollects pieces of identity through recollecting the stories of her own youth and the stories of myth and the ancestors. So it is very important to note that there is a combination of imagination and reality. There is a combination of myths. There is a combination of traditions, because the author has never been in China. So she was brought up in Stockton, California, and the stories that she wrote about were some narratives brought by her ancestors, by her relatives, by some movies, and by some events that she used to attend in the Confucius church. So all this made her being able to write the stories that shaped her identity and her individuality. So the story contains, as I said, many women. Before, please let me. So as I said before, that the story contains many women whom Maxine tried to identify with them. Before going to the analysis, I would like to read the 2 quotes which belong to the American author and psychologist and psychotherapist Phyllis Chesler. So with these two quotes, I am going to, based on these quotes, I am going to make my analysis. So the first quote is, in her study on women and madness, Phyllis Chesler questions female psychology conditioned by an oppressive and patriarchal male culture. It is clear that for a woman to be healthy, she must adjust to and accept the behavioral norms for her sex, even though these kinds of behavior are generally regarded as less socially desirable. The second quote is, what we consider madness, whether it appears in women or in men, is either the acting out of the devalued female role or the total or partial rejection of one's sex stereotypes. So the woman warrior is full of mad women. So there are women who are clinically mad, and there are women who are metaphorically mad. So there are women who have been institutionalized at the end when they went mad, and there are some women who are metaphorically mad, which means their madness was not treated clinically as some others. For example, in this novel, we have some females who lives next door to the mother of Maxine from Hong Kingston, whose name is Brave Orchid. So Brave Orchid has a neighbor. This neighbor becomes mad, and she has some mental instabilities. And she was once suspected to be a spy. Brave Orchid, the mother of Maxine, she tried to treat her because she is a midwife, and she also said to be treating ghosts and treating people who are suffering from these hallucinations. She tried to treat her, but her attempts went in vain. There is also a cheerful, crazy Mary. She is the daughter of Chinese converts. She enjoys attacking people, and she found happiness in the asylum. And there is a witch who is called Pina. This woman chases children whenever they went to gather herbs for their mothers. So the focus in this story is going to be on two main protagonists in the novel. The first one is the no-name woman. She is Maxine's aunt. Maxine Hong Kingston introduces her novel with this woman, the no-name aunt. So the reason why she is named the no-name aunt is because she committed adultery, and she gave birth to an illegitimate child, and she brought disgrace to her village in China. And the punishment was not mentioning her name at all in front of the children or the grandsons and daughter. This is why it is the first chapter is entitled "The No Name Women." So, and as a celebration to this woman, Maxine Hong Kingston devoted some papers to her to be the first chapter in her novel. So as I said, the story is the focus is going to be on the no-name woman, and Moon Orchid, who is the sister of Brave Orchid. She is also Maxine's aunt. So the first title, which is marriage as an ideal institution to guarantee citizenship. I'm going to read my quotation and explains it later on. Kingston writes, no-name woman as metaphorically mad, and Moon Orchid is clinically insane because they reject marriage as a structure of meaning that confers stability and value for the immigrant. Both are unintelligible because they do not conform to the logic of the community. So Moon Orchid is only considered as clinically mad, and no-name women can be called metaphorically insane because they do not fit into the norms and the ideal of the immigrant symbolic universe that upholds marriage as a mode of collective belonging. So, so during the immigration moment, marriage was considered as a gateway to gain the American citizenship. For a female to travel from China to America, she has to be married with one of the immigrants who went to live in the United States and establish themselves there. So though both of them have husbands as gold mountains, as immigrants who left China in order to settle in the United States. So both of them refuse to migrate to the United States and prefer to settle and stay in China. So they did not really want the citizenship, and they were very satisfied with their life in China. So both of which consider marriage they did not consider marriage as a way to happiness, and they stayed at home. As a result, both were excluded from the communal life, or we can say the norms and the ideals of the immigrants community, and disintegrated from the kinship relationship. So they were both were excluded from the families in China, and they were excluded from the immigrant community in the United States because they prefer to settle in China. So the fact that they refused to reconcile with the social order resulted in a failed marriage. So since they did not choose to live in the United States, so it is claimed that their marriage failed. And for the no-name woman, she committed suicide, while Moon Orchid, she turned to be mad and eventually put in an asylum. She was institutionalized and eventually died there. So it is stated that in the novel that it was a punishment for both, one with committing suicide and the other with turning mad, because they rebelled against marriage and they did not fit to the community in China or the USA. Moving to the second title, Madness as a Mental Illness Generated by the Phallocentric Discourse. Usually in the Chinese community, the majority of women depend on their man to secure a better life or a good life. So they they are completely dependent on their man in all the domains and all fields. But what is very unusual in this story is that the two protagonists did not depend on their husbands to survive, because they prefer, as I said before, they prefer to stay in China away from them. So as a result, they are considered as ghosts in the immigrants community. So for the no-name woman, she did not wait for her husband to depend on him. She lived her life without his presence next to her. So what the no-name woman did, she dares to desire by celebrating her own body and celebrating her own femininity, and betrayed her husband and committed adultery. As the narrator said, she combed individuality in her bob and maintained a perfect hairline and immaculately thread eyebrows. So she kept taking care of herself. Although her husband is absent, she kept willing to maybe sleep with other men, and maybe to enjoy her femininity. At the end, she gave birth to an illegitimate child and refused to name her after her father, and denies her father reproductive power. So, like the no-name woman, Moon Orchid also refused to depend on her marriage or her husband. She stayed in China. So though her husband became a successful surgeon in the United States and becomes very rich and wealthy, she preferred to remain in China and stay with her daughter. As it is said in the novel, she prefers to stay with her sister and her children, and she had a happy life in China. But her sister, Brave Orchid, forced her to go to the United States of America and claim her right as his wife. Because she told her that it is very important to ask for your right and ask for the financial support, because you are his wife, and if you not do this, his second wife, whom he married her in America, is going to take everything for her children. So Moon Orchid refused that, saying that she doesn't need any financial support from her husband. She doesn't need any kind of possession or any kind of inheritance. But Brave Orchid insisted that if she doesn't need money, so her daughter needs money. So she asked her to transfer the money or the inheritance, which are going to be provided by her husband, to her daughter. Moon Orchid was not convinced with this. And even when she went to California and meet her husband refused her existence along with her sister, and described her as grandmother, because their marriage were arranged and she is older than him. So she was replaced with a stylish, beautiful young American lady whom he depended on her in his work, and whom he needs to in order to receive his guests and his patients. So perhaps this is what made her situation even worse, and she became mentally unstabilized, and she turned into a mad woman. So her daughter and her sister took her to an asylum in California, where she settled there until she died. So here we notice in the two titles that both women did not depend on marriage to save their life, and did not depend also on any man to determine their status among the community they lived in, and the result was the exclusion from the communal life and the family as well. So one ends was with the suicide, and the other one ended with being mad and eventually death.
Sorry to interrupt, Barad. Would you mind moving to a conclusion, perhaps like a 2-minute conclusion? Would that be okay?
Okay, yes, I will.
Yeah, thanks.
No problem. So, as a conclusion for my paper, I would like to to read a quote. What finally distinguishes the warrior woman from the mad woman is the way that she talks and lives her story. The key lies in embracing the reality of manifold possibility, multiple identity. The impossible stories of dream and myth are truer on a deeper level than the all too possible stories of a world which seems designed to drive women crazy. Yet Kingston's talking story is not a flight from the world, but rather an attempt to revision the world of life experience in such a way that its rootedness in the images of myths and dream becomes apparent. So Maxime Hong Kingston is a critique of patriarchy and the immigration policies at the time within the space of madness. So the author identifies with these mad women, using their stories to fashion her own identity, seeing herself through the darkness of their insane stories. She insisted that sanity in hers, in the very multiplicity of stories of the self, however, renders these tales of madness curious metaphors for sanity. So these mad women became heroine of a sort, because their triumph is not that of the warrior women, but of the mad women. After all, these mad women are considered as victims because they did not surrender, or they were not subjected to the patriarchal codes. They were anti-patriarchal, they support an anti-patriarchal cause. Significantly, they all seem to be happy in their life and in their own choice, and eventually ended up with happiness and peace. This peaceful end is one Kingston hesitates to predict for herself, because she was hesitated to conform to the patriarchal codes of her community, or to rebel, or to defy the community's orders, or the community's laws imposed on her in particular, and on the Chinese and the Chinese American women in general. So this is all for my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and sorry for keeping it so long.
Thanks so much, Berideh. Already there's loads of dialogues with the first paper as well, which I'm sure we can get to in the Q&A. Thanks very much for that. So we're gonna move on to our third paper, which is by Alessia Zinari. So Alessia obtained her PhD at the University of Glasgow in August 2020. Her thesis, entitled Mental Illness, Women's Writing and Liminality, A comparative study of Leonora Carrington and Alda Marini is grounded in feminist theory and focuses on the works that the two authors produced as a result of their experiences of hospitalization in psychiatric institutions. In 2019, Alessia contributed to the edited collection Leonora Carrington, Living Legacies, which is with Venom Press, with a chapter on Carrington's liminal journey in Down Below, while continuing her exploration of the relationship between trauma and the self in the work of 20th century women creators. So thanks very much, Alessia.
Thank you very much for this great introduction, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you, Ben and Becky, for organizing this fantastic series. I've been really enjoying it so far. So I will be briefly describing myself. I am a 30-year-old Italian white woman. I have dark brown hair and brown eyes, and tonight I am wearing woolly black and white cardigan and a black turtleneck top. So I will now be sharing my slides, and you can see them okay. And feel free to interrupt me at any point if you can't hear me or can't see something. So all my slides are white background with black text. And in this first one, there is a picture of Alda Marini, who is the Italian author that I will be talking about today. So I will just start. More than 10 years after her death, the poet Alda Marini is still largely remembered in Italy as the poet who sang the pain of the marginalized. Marini was born in Milan in 1931 into a lower middle class family and started writing poems at a very young age. Although her parents disapproved of her poetic inclination, in one of her autobiographies, Marini writes that the lack of support and recognition from her parents triggered, quote, the first feelings of guilt, end of quote, that would later accompany her during the years of psychiatric hospitalization. After witnessing the horrors of the war, Marini entered, almost by accident, one of Milan's most prestigious literary circles and started publishing her poems in important poetic anthologies. Aged 22, she got married, and her marriage and 2 subsequent pregnancies slowed down her poetic activity. In 1965, Marini found herself in serious mental distress, and one night, after a heated fight with her husband, she was restrained and sent to a psychiatric hospital under circumstances that still remain unclear today. Marini would remain in the Paolo Pini Hospital for 10 years, going home at regular intervals until when she was eventually discharged. 20 years after her first hospitalization, she interrupted her poetic silence, collecting her memories of the asylum in 2 works. And here we have the cover pages of the 2 works. One is La Terra Santa, the Holy Land, and the memoir L'altra verità, Diario di una diversa, or The Other Truth, Diary of Another, which is the one I will be focusing on today. And just so that I make that clear, the translation of this memoir has not been translated in English, so the translations that you will see here today are my translations. Through an analysis on some crucial passages of the memoir, this paper seeks to demonstrate that Diario is a work charged with both literary and historical value that deserves more scholarly attention. Marini's memories shed new light on the situation of psychiatric patients, and especially of women in Italy, before and after Basaglia's reform on mental institutions, and I will be briefly touching on Basaglia. Demonstrating how the abuse that she suffered in the hospital reflects society's attitudes toward mental illness, disability, and women, Marini shows that the type of trauma narrative that is produced under institutions of coercive control, such as the mental asylum, will often be one of resistance to oppression. So labeling Marini's Diario as a specific genre is not an easy task. As it often happens with illness narratives, the structure of the memoir is non-linear, non-chronological, and fragmented, a fragmentation that mirrors the author's shattered self during and after the experience of hospitalization. Merini mixes prose with a series of paratexts, including letters, postscripts, and poetry, thus calling for a multivalent approach to the reading of the memoir. She uses the first person, either singular to indicate herself or plural to refer to herself and her fellow inmates, and employs the past tense consistently throughout the memoir. In Diario, many are the instances of repetition of the same event, which often coincide with the most painful recollections. As Kathy Caruth observes, the tendency towards repetition is one of the most common characteristics of trauma writing, and it serves the purpose of, quote, repeatedly bringing the traumatized person back into the situation of the trauma, end of quote, in order, as Rachel Spear notes, to, quote, bring it into one's consciousness, end of quote. The title, The Other Truth, suggests that Merini is presenting her version of the events that accompanied their hospitalization, a version that differs from the one told by the authoritarian figures that surrounded her, including the doctors and her husband. According to Sidonie Smith and Julia Watson, this type of life writing can be categorized as both narrative of illness and trauma, in which autobiography is, quote, used as a critique of the gendered and dehumanizing treatment accorded by institutions to vulnerable people, end of quote, and as narrative of witness, in which, according to Judith Butler, giving an account of oneself corresponds to an act of community building, and ultimately, quote, contributes to the human rights projects of social justice, end of quote. And we'll be talking about it, but I think there is a common line about community building and collective action in the papers that we've been reading today. The latter definition is particularly relevant to my reading of Merini as I interpret her memoir as a politicized narrative of trauma. In Shattered Subject, Suzette Enke brings together these two definitions of life writing as testimony and as illness narrative, and frames these complex narratives as testimonial life writing, which is the definition I adopt today. I won't be reading the quotes because I'm aware of time, and I prefer to read the quotes from the memoir. So I'll leave it here on the screen. Enke argues that testimonial life writing helps the subject in the process of, quote, reinventing the shattered self as a coherent subject capable of meaningful resistance to received ideologies and of effective agency in the world, end of quote. A phenomenon that she observes particularly in women's memoirs, and that, I argue, is also present in Merini. It is for this reason that, as Susanna Scarparo and Rita Wilson observe, women's autobiography, quotes, needs to be understood as political practice, but also as an effort to investigate one's place in the world, end quote. In the following pages, I will show how Merini, a shattered subject, acquires in the process of reinventing herself through writing, not only human agency as an individual, but also political agency as part of a group, that of marginalized mentally ill people, and especially women. So now I will be talking about Merini's critique of the asylum as an institution. Merini was incarcerated between 1965 and 1975, a period during which psychiatry saw major changes on both a national and international level, which culminated with the closing of asylums in Italy at the end of the 1970s, thanks to the campaign led by the influential radical psychiatrist Franco Basaglia. So I don't have much time to talk about him. In this slide, you can see two pictures of Basaglia, one standing alone and the other one, I believe, in the Gorizia hospital in North Italy. But he was an important figure for the process of the institutionalization that happened in Europe, and is comparable to R.D. Laing, for example, here in Scotland, so anti-psychiatry figure. The law that closed the asylum was known as the Basaglia Reform, or Law 180, and it was the result of a period of intense ideological turmoil that started with the students' and workers' revolts of 1968 in the US and Europe. This period was accompanied by the refusal of any system of coercive control that in any way resembled the still too vivid memories of the war and of concentration camps. Prior to the Basaglia Reform, the concept of therapy for Italian psychiatry meant custody and restraint. As Giulia Melani notes, quote, mental asylums did not represent in any way a service to the care of the patients, but they were instead institutions of discipline, end of quote. The dehumanization of the patients within the asylum is a key theme in Merini's memoir. In her opening, she recalls the feelings of dread upon her arrival at the hospital, in the moment when she realized that she would not be able to return home. I was therefore hospitalized against my will, and at the time I didn't even know about the existence of mental asylums. But when I found myself in there, I think I went mad right away, as I realized I entered a labyrinth that would be impossible to exit. With these words, Merini emphasizes the violent nature of her incarceration and provides her readers with important details on the process of institutionalization. At the time, in fact, inmates could only be detained by order of a family member, and once hospitalized, it would be very difficult for them to be discharged. She remembers being taken to the asylum against her will, and the episode is described in terms that evoke an instance of kidnapping. She also reveals that she was completely unaware of the existence of these institutions. This is a plausible detail, as a, quote, sane citizen at the time would have no reason to know about mental hospitals, because, as Erving Goffman observes, these structures were hidden away from society and relegated to the margins. Throughout the memoir, Merini tries to recall her memories of the space of the asylum as faithfully as she can, in order to convey the extent of the terrifying images she witnessed. She explains how it would be impossible, even for the healthiest of individuals, to leave this institution without being irreversibly transformed. She writes, "The hours in that terribly sad place never passed. They, the staff, would line us up on some long old benches, all of us, with our faces all the same, amorphous, and we would stare at the floor as if we were sentenced to death. They would never give us anything to do. The nurses never looked at us." The patients in the asylum regress to the state of a subhuman and non-entity, a process that is expedited by the nurses' lack of empathy for their condition, which even manifests itself as a repulsion or in acts of aggression towards the patients. Just as mental asylums are invisible to the rest of the world, so the inmates are invisible to the hospital staff. Time loses meaning within the walls of the asylum. As in concentration camps and prisons, where everyone looks the same, so the patients in the female ward of the Paolo Pini look, and these are quotes from Merini, like a coven of witches, dressed in the same uniforms, annihilated by the daily cycle of abuse and made amorphous by the heavy pharmacological treatments. These passages show that by offering a testimony of the horrors witnessed in the asylum, Merini finds meaning and order and is able to map her way out these traumatic recollections. Merini describes the asylum as a paradoxical institution, one that is portrayed in society as a place of care, but that is in fact a place of sorrow, abandonment, and violence. She expresses her disappointment at realizing, once back in her home in Milan, that the people who live outside do not really understand the entity of the abuse that psychiatric inmates go through while hospitalized. For this reason, at the midpoint in her narrative, Merini defines the psychiatric hospital as a false institution. The asylum is more certainly a false institution, one of those that, having been created in the name of solidarity and of human understanding, have no other purpose than to satisfy man's sadistic instincts. And we were the innocent victims of these institutions. There were people who needed psychiatric care, this is true, but there were also people who were there because of the greediness and thirst of power of others, and I was well aware of this. This is why Basaglia did well to close them, creating, this is clear, other problems that still remain unresolved. This extract exemplifies the socio-political analysis that Merini performs in the Diario. The author is seeking recognition and validation as a victim of institutional violence and aims to expose a type of discrimination, social stigma, that was not openly addressed by either the institutions, the press, or the literary scene at the time she was writing. Feeling betrayed by the same society that has first celebrated her as a child prodigy when she was published very young in poetic anthologies, and then labeled her insane, Merini has the opportunity through the memoir to describe the extent of her abuse and to finally find a way to react to the injustice that she witnessed and experienced. And so now I will come to the conclusion. I will just show you briefly how she voices women's oppression in her memoir. I should perhaps specify before that Merini never aligned herself with the feminist movement, but I argue that she ultimately delivers a feminist message through her writing on the asylum, showing that patriarchal oppression plays a fundamental role in women's mental health. This is evident, for example, in the description of the night of her hospitalization, where she offers a picture of the condition of women in 20th century Italian society. I was a happy mother and wife, even if sometimes I would get tired and my mind would not function. I tried to speak about this with my husband, but he pretended not to understand, and so my breakdown got worse. One night I lost my temper, and my husband thought it was a good idea to call an ambulance, without realizing that they would take me to the asylum. But at that time the law was strict. In 1965, women were subject to men, and men could make decisions regarding their future. Throughout the memoir, Merini reflects on the dynamics of power that characterize different types of institutions, such as the family, society, and the mental hospital, and finds that these all share a similar hierarchy in relation to gender. To further stress the role that her husband played in her incarceration, Merini writes that once he went back to the hospital to take her home, she deliberately decided not to accompany him because I had taught myself to see him as an enemy. Sorry, I was just checking the chat. Yeah, okay. Merini also draws upon the voices of her fellow inmates in the women's ward. So she uses testimonies by her fellow inmates. For instance, she records a testimony collected for another former patient of the Paolopini, Mrs. B, who shares the memory of her traumatic experience of giving birth inside the asylum. This is the last quote I will show you today. I had 2 pregnancies in the asylum. When the moment came to give birth, I was regularly sent to the seclusion room as a preventive measure. Actually, it was the other people who were afraid of who knows what absurd reaction. In this way, I gave birth twice, tied up, and I wasn't allowed to cry or scream, because in asylums, to scream or express your fears is strictly forbidden. This is the degree to which they repressed us and made us even more frustrated. As a result of collecting these testimonies, Merini's memoir becomes a sort of collective endeavor, through which she finds relief from her trauma by comparing her experiences to those of other women. Furthermore, transcribing these memories on paper and organizing them in a publication affords them a new status within the collective consciousness of Italian society. So to conclude, in this paper I've argued that Alda Merini's L'altra verità, Diario di una diversa, constitutes an important work from both a literary and a historical perspective. What I have suggested is a re-evaluation of this memoir as a unique testimony of the situation in Italian asylums during the years of the Basaglia reforms, and as an example of the political implications of narrating personal trauma. I have also proposed a new reading of Merini's work, showing that her politicization of illness can be read through a feminist lens. While many critics, scholarly and otherwise, have defined Diario as a work that is mainly confessional, I have demonstrated that this memoir can be read as a sort of political manifesto, through which the author is able to redefine herself as an empowered subject, which in turn helps her in her healing process. This, I argue, can become a blueprint through which to read other memoirs of illness authored by women. This is the works I cited. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Alessia. That was absolutely brilliant. We've got about 15 minutes for questions, so I want to get straight to it. So we've got as much time as possible. So we already have 2 questions in the chat from Roxana. So Roxana, do you want to ask these yourself, or I can read them out as well? well, maybe if I read them out. Okay, great. Yeah, the first one is for Anne. I'll maybe read them both out, and then we can go to each speaker. So a question for Anne. For me, it seems that the noblesse is an instance of that nervous condition which Sartre predicated about the colonized in his preface to Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. Is there any mention of Sartre in the Blesse aesthetique? And then a question after that for Béradet in Gilbert and Drubar's seminal study, The Mad Woman in the Attic. The mad woman defying patriarchal regimes and being a proto-feminist was also analysed as a source of creativity. Women writers, women artists. Are the mad women in Maxine Hong Kingston also creative? Okay, so I guess Anne first and then Béradet after that.
Okay, thanks, Roxana, for the question. So the short answer would be no, not that I think of. I don't, not that I know of. I don't think there's a mention of Sartre in the Blesse aesthetic. And I think the relationship with the nervous condition would be maybe that for Sartre, it's something that comes from the colonizer with the consent of the colonized. But with the nervous condition, there's still that duality that it's coming from who it's coming from. Whereas with the Blesse aesthetic, it's a reclaiming of what that means and what that is for the woman writer in my example.
Is it my turn?
Yeah, Béradet, if you want to.
So the question was, are there any are there any creative women in Yes, there are mainly two creative women in Maxine Hong Kingston, the woman warrior. We have the legend of Femme Moulin. So there is I think a film adaptation or you know, the Disney World, there is the protagonist who is called Moulin. So Femme Moulin, she was a woman warrior. It is this woman took the title of the novel. When she was a child, she was taken to the mountains away from her parents, where she was taught the art of war. So these women were brought up mainly to avenge her father. And to bring back glory to her village. So when this woman grew up, she was able to fight side by side to her future husband, and she was disguised as a man. So at the end, she was able to bring glory, and she was able to fight the oppressive king. And she eventually married her friend and brought children. So in this story is so inspirational that in the sense that this woman could assume both roles, being a female who takes care of her husband and her children, and also being a woman warrior who fought side by side with a man. We have I have also another woman whose name is Su Yin. This woman was kidnapped from China by the barbarians. So this woman lived with the barbarian community, and she was able to successfully assimilate with them. And she also got married with one of the barbarian and have two children. What is significant in her story is that in order not to lose her identity and her language, she used to teach her children the language of the Chinese when her husband used to leave the tent or used to leave the house. So she was able to transmit her language through song. songs because they were famous with singing and making the instruments. And when she returned home to China, she was able also to learn from the barbarians song who also used the instrument. And in this way, she was able to preserve her patrimony and moved it to her children. And the successful thing is that she was able to assimilate within the barbarian, and like Moon Orchid, who was unable to assimilate. We have also we have also Brave Orchid, who is the sister of Moon Orchid. So Brave Orchid also did not depend on her husband. She financed her own education. She started to study at how do we call it, when she becomes a woman with children, she was able to secure her own studies, and she became a successful midwife, and she was the first in her promotion, and she was able to save many people's life. And also she used to treat people who, as I said before, who has some hallucinations about ghosts, etc. So she is also an inspirational figure to Maxine. And these three women were an inspiration to Maxine that she could rely on to build her own identity. I hope I answered my question.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Berede. I know Becky also had a comment on this paper. I don't know whether you want to voice that yourself, Becky.
Yeah, it was just a reference to Bly, but I think Alessia's already messaged back about it. But I was just in the process of typing a question. I don't know whether I can be cheeky and kind of jump in there, but it was a question for Alessia. It was I was wondering whether you could elaborate more on Marini's positionality in the text as an inmate of the asylum. So is she ill in any way at all, or is she kind of like Bly, kind of in a way, Nellie Bly, like someone reporting on what's going on, and she's not ill at all? She's just there for that kind of purely misogynist practice of just being interned because she's showing some outburst of emotion or sort of so-called hysteria. And then my second question was about the time frame, or the process of writing this text. Do you know if it was kind of she was released and then she wrote it, or was she able to write while she was in the asylum?
Yeah, thank you for your excellent questions. I'll try to be brief. I think it's different from Bly because Marini, we don't know whether she was diagnosed as schizophrenic, but we don't know, again, whether the diagnosis was accurate or not. But she definitely was struggling with mental illness even before she was hospitalized, which is probably the reason why eventually she ended up in a mental asylum, is that she had been struggling with depression. So I don't know what happened. Maybe the husband, if he was interviewed by the doctor, he did say something like, oh yeah, she's been depressed or something. And so she was restrained and brought to the hospital. So she was suffering of mental health. And as she says, then the problem is that it's kind of a vicious cycle. You don't know what starts first, because she says that as soon as she finds herself in the cell of the asylum, she goes mad right away. So at that point, there is a process in herself that after that first night there, she realizes that she was condemned to stay there because that was the start of her illness, really. And there is also this idea of wanting to rebel against her husband. So almost finding that the only way she had to stay away from her family for a while. So I think that it's less voyeuristic in the sense that she is part of the community, that she's going through the treatment. She's not going there just to explore like a journalist, but she does have a journalistic tone when she writes the memoir. And I think it is because she wants to be as credible as possible, and she wants to be heard by the people that are outside, as she describes. So she ends up being somewhat of a reporter. And then the other question is very interesting because she writes, this is the reason why this is a memoir rather than a diary, although she calls it diario, is that she writes it 20 years after her first day of hospitalization, which means 10 years after she's been released. So it's definitely, she almost for nearly 10 years, she cannot write a word. And then she has this moment that she just starts writing and she can't stop. And I've been in the archive where the manuscript is conserved, and it's interesting because the manuscript was at least 5 times longer than the edited work. So she couldn't stop writing about it. So I think that's also quite interesting.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Alessia. I think we've got time for one more question or a couple of extra questions. So if anyone has any questions, put up your hand or put them in the chat. In the meanwhile, I've got a quick question for Alessia as well. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed your paper. I was just wondering. I hate to be that person that like asks a question that's like about stuff that I'm interested in, but like I'm very interested in kind of the actual architectures of hospitals and clinical spaces, and I was wondering how are these spaces actually described in the text, and are there many allusions to the actual physical architectures of the asylum? And also, I noticed that you use the word self-recovery, and also in your abstract, you talk about self-recovery, and it's actually the first time I've heard this phrase, self-recovery, and just kind of like wondering how you feel that kind of these spaces could be more or less geared towards that type of self-recovery, and what you mean by self-recovery as well.
Great, thank you. When you say these spaces, you mean the spaces of writing or the spaces like the asylum space?
Yeah, like the asylum spaces, like the physical, clinical spaces.
Yes, okay, great. So thank you for your questions. When it comes to the architecture of the asylum, she doesn't really describe necessarily the architecture. What she describes are mainly the corridors. So probably that's the architecture, actually. I don't think she goes into much detail. She describes the long corridor, she describes the cells. I didn't go into details, but Merini, there is a strong reference to religion and myth in her work, and elsewhere I do analyze that. So she compares herself sometimes, the cell for her becomes the cell of the nun or the monk. So she rereads that experience as a mystical experience. And obviously many of those elements, including for example, the suffering of the flesh, of the body, they acquire a religious meaning. And obviously being in a structure that reminds her of a monastery, for example, and the idea of I don't remember the name in English, but those nuns that can't go out the monastery, basically, she sees herself as one of them. And also the garden is very important for her, because the garden, and again the connection to nature, is the moment when she realizes that she can get out of the asylum. And especially the roses, which is also a very important religious symbol, especially in Christian Catholic religion, become almost the seed of understanding that even in that place there can be beauty. And from there, the process of, again, recovery is I would say, initiated. This idea of self-recovering actually comes from Merini herself. She basically says that thanks to the asylum and the fact that she has learned about psychoanalysis, because her psychiatrist has actually started practicing psychoanalysis, she learns self-analysis, which is actually something that is in complete contradiction with Freudian analysis. You can't do self-analysis. You need to be two people in dialogue. But she says that through writing, she practiced self-analysis, but she couldn't do that if it wasn't for the tools that she's learned inside the asylum through her psychiatrist, who, as a means of therapy, at some point gave her a typer while she was in the asylum, although we don't know what she typed. But so definitely, also, if you talk to her when she was still alive, it's interesting because once she came out, basically, she was never fully condemning the asylum, because she says that it still gave her the key to understand her illness. And that's why I talk about self-recovering. But it's definitely something that happens out with the asylum when she is then released in a way.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks so much. And this idea of self-analysis I find so interesting. I'll have to look at, while you said it, I Googled self-recovery because I just never heard this before. And I wondered whether it was kind of like a play on words of self-discovery or something like that. And I've instantly found like lots of references to it, which I'll have to explore. Thanks so much, Alessia.
Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out.
I think that we've just come to the end of our time. So if there are no other questions, there's a comment from Anne who said, a comment for Alessia, I like the relationship that seems to be between physicality and madness, since Ben talked about the physical space in one of your quotes. The mad women are described as amorphous. Yeah, that's true. I noticed that in the quote as well. Anne, do you want to say that comment?
Well, just real quickly, it's just when you mentioned that the description of the physical space, right? And I was remembering like that quote that you had, Alessia, about, you know, the mad woman kind of losing shape, right? So there is again that detachment between the mind and the body, and then when you talk about that within the physical space of the asylum, there is that, you know, that like inside outside, you know. So I think, and I see that coming back quite often when we talk about madness in women. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, thank you. I also did pay attention when you mentioned embodiment, and that's something that's definitely is happening in Merini, and she interprets it again in a religious way, because the idea of soul and body, flesh versus spirit is very much present in obviously in spiritual thought. So she does use that as a key to access this duality that and she keeps them in constant tension, which I find it's quite interesting as well.
Thanks so much. Well, I just want to say thanks so much to all three speakers. I really enjoyed all of those papers. That's fantastic. It's been fantastic to have you as part of the series. And I'll just pass over to Becky to finish, because we've got our final seminar series, the seminar 13 next week. So yeah, I'll just pass over to Becky now to introduce that.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And yeah, I reiterate what Ben just said. Like, thank you so much for your three papers. There were some real kind of like juicy kind of crossovers, intersections, particularly this idea of something that I didn't ask because I didn't have much time, but this idea of like the valorization of madness, because I always feel like there's this tension, so of valorizing it as a space like to critique or a space to protest, but it's ultimately suffering in many respects. So I find it something kind of, yeah, difficult to grapple with often in my own research. Anyway, that was my little pushing my own research onto your papers. Sorry, everyone. Anyway, all right, I'll stop babbling and introduce the next and final seminar. So here, I'm putting the link for registration in the chat. So please, everyone, go and register for our next and final seminar. So it will be taking place on the 23rd of March. So one Tuesday. I can't count, 2 weeks from today at the same time, 5:30 p.m. And our theme is very similar to this week. We've got, it's kind of like a lovely extension from this week. The title is Neurology and Psychiatry, Female Experiences of Mind Doctors. And we have papers from James Rakowski from KCL, Cahalan's Double Binds, Reflex Advocacy and Self-Making in Memoirs of Brain Encephalitis, Eliza Toledo from Brazil, who's going to be speaking on gender violence in life and hospitalization of female psychiatric patients in Brazil, 1930 to 1950. And finally, Louise Carrie-Moreau from TCD Ireland, who will be giving a paper entitled The Cynical Vision of Psychiatry in Dépense by Blondie. So yeah, that's it. Those are 3 papers. Please register and yeah, come along. It'll be our final one. And yeah, thank you all for coming this evening.